If you've been attending the Dallas Chocolate Festival over the past decade, you've probably learned a thing or two about how to make chocolate. Maybe you've even gotten some beans and made a batch yourself. But that wasn't enough for Nate Saal. He's a Silicon Valley geek with a Yale molecular biophysics and biochemistry degree, and he spent the last few years of his life at his company, CocoTerra, designing a robot that can make chocolate for you. Drop in nibs, press a few buttons on your phone, and out comes a ring of chocolate. Yeah, his robot doesn't make bars, it makes rings of chocolate. To figure out how to do that, he's had to dig deep into all the physical and chemical processes involved in chocolate making. Everything from how to get the chocolate smooth to tempering and making sure there aren't little bubbles in the finished product. So if you want to talk about chocolate and robots and chemistry and physics, Nate's your guy. So, Nate, first question, when will we be able to buy our own chocolate making robot?
That is a great question. As soon as we have them coming off the factory line, they'll be out there in people's homes. So I can't give you a date yet, but if you go to CocoTerra.com, you can sign up, get on our mailing list, and you will be the first to know. That's how we'll distribute that information. So get on there. So hello, everybody. My name is Nate Saal. I'm the founder and CEO of CocoTerra. As Sandra mentioned, my background is actually in the tech world, although on the weekends, you'll find me cooking, growing, making. And so I've done everything from beekeeping, winemaking, olive oil making. I have a pretty big garden. I love to cook and make all the time. And got into the world of chocolate and have learned a lot and wanted to share that with you and hopefully turn you into a true chocolate geek. So let me share my presentation here and we will kick this off. So we will start off just with a little bit of history. And I will mention as I get started, there is a Q&A. We'll have that at the end. So if you have questions, please go ahead and submit those questions through the app. And we'll tackle them all at the end. I think there are probably some experts out there as well. I know you can answer those questions also, so feel free to chime in and be interactive. So a little bit about the history of chocolate. The first is, and I put chocolate in quotes here, and I'll explain why. The first is the history. So it is a long and complex history. There was a session yesterday that talked about a lot of it. It really is deserving of its own session. I'm only going to hit a few dates just to give you the context of where we are today and where we started. So really some of the first evidence is probably about 1500 BC, the Olmec people having used in cacao. There's actually some other research that has it going back to 4500 BC. Typically what they do is they'll do analysis of different bowls and vessels that have been buried or used to try to determine what people's used or harvested and used cacao. Now after the Olmec, there's a tradition in the Mayan people using cacao, actually growing cacao. And a lot of it was ritualistic. And we'll see throughout this history is typically used by the upper class or religious class. And that continued for many years. After the Mayans, you actually had the Aztec using cacao, now less available to them and considered really something rare. In fact, it was so rare that it became a currency. So you could trade, right, tomatoes, avocados, eggs for cacao. And depending on the quality of that cacao, those beans, they had different value if they were beat up or fresh. The history in the cacao there was again used as a drink, as religious, and that's why I put chocolate in quotes here, because what we think of as cacao, as chocolate, as bar, is relatively new invention. So most of the history of chocolate was really a drink. The first sort of explorers to come in contact, it was actually Columbus, who came into contact with cacao for the first time and was introduced into Spain. And it was a drink still. Now it was modified. Sugar was added to it. It became a little bit more palatable, but still, again, something reserved for the rich and the wealthy. And you can zoom forward here, the bottom right, you'll see 1847. It's a good date to know in the world of chocolate. It's really when the first eating chocolate became available. So Fry and Sons in the UK and England created the first solid bar that became commercially available. And as mass commercialization, industrialization happened, it actually brought this down from something limited to the rich to something that could now be afforded by the masses. And again, all this is happening in South America. So realize, so that's sort of the heart of cacao. Let's talk about where chocolate comes from. So Theobroma cacao. So Theobroma means food of the gods. So if you ever hear that phrase, it comes from the scientific name for the tree. That's right, chocolate grows on trees. Here's a picture of the pod growing on that tree. A couple interesting things about this tree. The first, you'll notice here that the fruit, the pod, is actually growing off the trunk of the tree. This is a bit unusual in the fruit world. As you probably are aware, most fruit grows on the end of the branches of most trees, but not in the case of cacao. It's called the cauliflora. There are other examples of this. One that you've heard of is coffee. A couple that you haven't heard of or may have heard of. One is jackfruit, another jaboticaba. It's quite stunning when you see some of these trunks that are laden with fruit. It's a bit unusual, but quite fascinating. The other thing you need to know is that these trees really need warm temperatures, day and night. So it limits where they can grow. So typically, cacao trees can only grow about 15-20 degrees north and south of the equator. So what does that mean? It means for the United States that we're really not going to be growing any cacao here as global warming continues with dramatic effect, except there is actually one state that does grow cacao commercially, and that's Hawaii. So if you ever have a chance to travel to Hawaii, you can find some cacao plantations. I highly recommend you go there. You'll find some growers that are actually chocolate makers as well. So they are, instead of bean to bar, they're tree to bar makers. It's quite delicious. The other thing you should know is that all these little fruits come from little flowers. And those flowers are actually pollinated by a very particular insect. It's a little midge. And in order to have a very good harvest, you need that midge working in collaboration with that tree to pollinate all those flowers and get a good crop. You can see there's a variety of shapes and sizes and colors to these cacao pods. It turns out, historically, traditionally, people thought that there were really only 3 varietals. So the conventional wisdom was that you had this criollo, which was the fine flavored, sort of highly prized varietal. You had a forastero, which was less desirable, and then a cross between the two, which created the trinitario. Now, with much more available genetic testing, they've actually been able to do a lot of research and take samples of different cacao from different countries. And they sort of debunked this 3 varietals wisdom. And it turns out that there are more like 11 genetic clusters. So genetic cluster meaning that most of the DNA from that particular varietal is much the same. And what they also found out is that there are very few pure varietals, meaning of one of those, a tree that has genetics to just one cluster alone. And that most of the cacao is actually a hybrid or a cross between these different genetic clusters. In fact, many are hybridized or combinations of not just one, 2, 3, it's a number of them. A little bit about cacao and how it grows. First thing you probably know this is that, like coffee and wine, there's a lot of variety and flavor depending on where it comes from. This is from Megan Giller's book, and recommend that if you haven't read it. You can have all sorts of different flavor profiles, and that depends on a lot of different factors: the terroir, the varietal, how it's fermented, etc. We'll go into a little bit more detail of that later. The other thing that's important to know, and most people don't know, is that cacao is typically grown on small family farms. We're talking, let's say, 3 to 5 acre farms. This is how they make their money, or they help supplement their income from other farming. So that's it's not part of big agra to an extent at this point. And those fruits, this is me in a plantation. The fruits are all hand harvested. So why is that? So unlike, let's say, big agra, again, that has machines, mechanisms that can harvest either by shaking or pruning, machines that can go in and grab. There's a lot of neat technology that's happening there. These are all hand harvested with some kind of a blade. And that's really important because what they've found out is that if you rip these fruits off without a clean cut, you can actually damage the tree. And that means that you're going to get fewer flowers and thus fewer fruits the following season. So it's fairly labor intensive to go in and harvest all these. Imagine how much chocolate is made around the world, and each one of those is hand harvested. And they're also typically cracked open by hand with machetes or little mallets. Here's one that I popped open on the left. You'll see inside is sort of the sleeve string of seeds, and quite tasty. If this white pulp that surrounds the seeds, mucilage, also known as baba. If you ever have a chance to go to a farm or a plantation, I highly recommend that you take some seeds, take a pod, break it open, and suck on them. Do not bite on them. I don't know if anybody's ever played a joke on you. If you've ever pulled an olive off of a tree, it's a pretty bad experience. This is maybe not quite as bad, but similarly, you will probably end up spitting out that seed. It's very astringent, bitter, difficult to eat. And that makes sense. So evolutionarily, right, you want animals to desire to break open these pods and suck on those seeds, but you really don't want them destroying the seed itself. So by creating the sort of bitter compounds, it means things like monkeys and other animals will certainly suck on them and toss them, or eat them and excrete them around the forest, which helps disseminate those seeds and spread cacao. You see a little seedling there in the middle. That's one I'm growing. It's about double the size right now. It's an understory crop. So typically below the larger trees, likes a little bit of shade, not too much direct sun. And they'll get, I don't know, 25, 30 feet tall about. So what happens to these seeds? So the next step in the process is fermentation. So historically, these seeds would be harvested, they'd be piled up on banana leaves, covered in banana leaves, and left in a fermentation pile. So we'll get into that a little bit. Here's an example. This isn't a pile on the ground. This is actually in a little fermentation chamber. But there's really the first week of these cacao seeds' life are spent in fermentation. And so what's happening? Let's dig into a little bit on the fermentation. So the first part is actually a traditional, typical yeast fermentation. This is what happens in the wine industry when making wine. In the case of wine, you have a yeast that's eating the sugar from the grapes and turning it into alcohol. Same thing happens here. They're taking the sugar from the pulp, from that mucilage or baba, and they're converting it into alcohol. But there's a second stage in the case of cacao, which you don't have in wine. But if you ever have wine vinegar, that's that same transformation. Here you have an acetobacter or lactobacter that's turning that alcohol into acetic acid or lactic acid. Same thing happens in vinegar world. You take, again, grape juice turns into wine, wine turns into vinegar. Here you have the pulp that turns into alcohol that infuses into the seed. Importantly, it kills the seed. In, again, these humid climates, these seeds will germinate very, very quickly. So you want those seeds to be killed off right away. And then that acetobacter will turn that alcohol into acetic acid. And again, all these compounds are infusing into the bean. And it's very important in terms of flavor development. They say it develops the chocolate flavor precursors. Okay, so all these complex flavor compounds are being generated through this fermentation process. Again, after about a week, those beans or seeds are then spread out and dried. And they can be out in the sun or in these drying sheds. And that's what's then sent out to chocolate makers. Okay, so you're getting these fermented and dried seeds, beans, to then make chocolate. So let's get into the chocolate making. Let's get into those processes. Let's get into the steps and a little bit more detail on the science and chemistry of that. So the first thing you need to know, and hopefully you all know this, if not, it's one of those nuggets. 4 ingredients make all the chocolate: white, milk, dark. It's simply the ratio or inclusion or exclusion of these ingredients: cocoa nibs, cocoa butter, sugar, and milk powder, that make white milk dark chocolate. Okay. So where do those ingredients come from? Obviously sugar, you know where that comes from. Milk powder, again, this is powder, no liquid, no water. You don't want any water in your chocolate, so it's always powdered milk. And give you an idea of what the ratios are of those ingredients. So if you have 100% dark chocolate, that can just be nibs. It can be 100% nibs that's turned into chocolate. If you have a percentage, if it's 75% cacao, typically what that means is that you have 75% nibs and about 25% sugar there. European style dark will have added cocoa butter. Milk chocolate will have all 4 of these ingredients, and a white chocolate will have sugar, cocoa butter, and milk powder. And so you get an idea of, one, what ingredients are in these different types of chocolates, but also some of the health profiles of each of these. So obviously the darker the better. From your dark chocolate will be the most healthy to your white, less healthy. Okay. So, but where do the actual nibs and cocoa butter come from? We'll get into that here. So as I mentioned, the cocoa pod is fermented, dried, you get these beans. And now those beans are now roasted, and that's a skill in and of itself. And there's a lot of chemistry going on there with the Maillard effect and proper roasting and flavor development. And then those seeds need to be crushed so that you can get the shell off. And during that crushing process, the meat of that seed is broken apart into little pieces, and those are called cocoa nibs. Okay, so that's where those come from. And then those nibs can then be put into a press. And if you press and heat those nibs, a liquid will run out, and that liquid is cocoa butter. Now, it has the word butter in it, but it's not a dairy product. It's the fat from the nibs. And the nib is about 50% fat. Now, what's left behind is this dark, solid puck. If you were to take that solid puck and grind it up, guess what you get? Cocoa powder. So cocoa powder, cocoa butter make up essentially chocolate, 100% dark chocolate. Okay, so let's get into all the different steps, transformational steps, and regardless of sort of what machinery you're using, you have to go through all these steps to make chocolate. So it's grinding, refining, conching, tempering, and molding. And we'll deep dive into some of these here. So grinding. The first thing you need to know is, much like, let's say, peanuts, there is fat trapped in the cells of the nibs, of the cocoa nibs. Okay. And to release that fat, you need to warm them and crush them, break those cells open. So, and that's really that first step, is starting to break down those nibs, and that releases the fat. And so you take your sort of solids and you start turning it into a liquid, as long as you keep it warm. You then can add in your other ingredients. So if you're making, a simple dark chocolate, it may just be sugar, but you can add cocoa butter, you can add milk powder, flavorings at this point, and you're going to go through what's called a refining process. And the refining is really about getting the particle size very, very small, 20 microns. So a micron is 1,000th of a millimeter. Your hair is probably about 100 microns thick. You want 20 microns or below. So why is that important? Why 20 microns? Well, it turns out that at about 30, 35 microns, your tongue can detect grittiness. So if you drop it below that threshold, what you eat will taste creamy and smooth. So if you want a creamy, smooth tasting chocolate, you need to refine all these ingredients down to below 20 microns. Okay, conching, the next step. So let's get into conching, and this is can be controversial. It's a relatively new invention. So 1879, Lindt invented the conch. Supposedly it was an accident, left a machine running overnight, and discovered that it changed the flavor and texture of the chocolate. And again, there's still debate over what it does, how it changes the flavor and texture, and it really can be a combination of a lot of things, and I'll go into some of them here. So aeration. So obviously aerating products, so think of like wine. You break open a bottle of wine, open that up, and you let it breathe. So air obviously affects food. Some of it is through oxidation. So those are oxygen molecules that are interacting with the compounds in the chocolate that can affect the flavor. It may be that when you're manipulating the chocolate at an elevated temperature, which is what you do when you're conching, you're warming up this chocolate and moving it slowly around. You may be evaporating, right, or volatilizing different compounds, flavor compounds in the chocolate. Obviously, that will affect the flavor for sure. Now, as you're warming it and sloshing it around, you may also dehydrate it. You may get some of those water molecules. So there's a little bit of water in those beans when you start making chocolate. You can get some of that water to evaporate away. And that, again, can change the viscosity and the texture of the chocolate. Some people say it's reorganization. It's about how the cocoa butter molecules are packing around these pieces that are floating in the cocoa butter. And if you get a tighter pack and think about something that's covered fully in cocoa butter, it may react differently with your tongue. And others say it's about a smoothing. If you think about these little pieces of sugar, little pieces of the bean that are broken up, they may have rough edges. And so if you slowly manipulate the chocolate liquid, the mass, you're going to round out those edges. And so when those rounded edges then again hit your tongue, you're going to get a different experience. It can be a combination, any and all of those. Some people don't even go through a conching process. They think it, minimizes flavor. If you start off with really good fine flavor cacao, why would you want to minimize flavor? Others say, no, it's really important step. So I'm not going to get into the politics of conching, but just try to explain what's going on or what the theories are of what's going on. Tempering. So we're going to, again, go into a lot of detail here on tempering and some of the science here. There are typically 3 tempering methods that are used. One is called table tempering, where you pour chocolate out on a table on usually a cold stone slab. And you're going to temper the chocolate by manipulating it and moving it around on that slab and affecting its temperature. You can get a tempering machine, as you see here in the middle, or you can seed it, meaning you're going to take tempered chocolate, put that in untempered chocolate, and that will then temper the whole batch. So let's get into some of the details of chocolate. So the first thing of tempering, the first thing you need to know is that chocolate is a suspension. What does that mean? It means it's particles floating around in fat. That fat is the cocoa butter. And this is a picture that I took through a microscope. You can see little crystals. Those crystals are sugar. You can see the sort of brown bits, that's broken up pieces of the cocoa bean. And those are all floating. It's not an emulsion, meaning it's not sort of like water and oil, which gets broken up into these little balls that sort of don't really fully mix, but look like they're mixed as an emulsion. This really is stuff floating in fat, okay? And what is that fat? Cocoa butter is what's called a triglyceride. Tri because it has these 3 chains. Most fats that we consume from olive oil to others are very similar to this in structure. You can see that molecule there. And those 3 chains actually can have different forms. And for cocoa butter, they primarily take these 3, they have the palmitic, oleic, and stearic chains on it. And it creates, again, the POS, SOS, POP would be the 3 most common chains in combination that exist if you were to just take cocoa butter and do an analysis of it. Okay. So let's get it into tempering and what's interesting about this molecule. The first thing you need to know, I guess this is probably actually the third thing you need to know, is that cocoa butter is a polymorph. Poly meaning many, morph meaning sort of shape. it can take many shapes. And turns out that this molecule can crystallize or connect to itself in 6 different ways. And you see those here, 1 through 6 in Roman numerals. And each of those forms melts at a different temperature, which also means they get generated at different temperatures. Okay. If you look on the left, that's actually a picture of some chocolate that I made or tried to temper. It did not temper fully. And what you're seeing there is actually what looks like, right, your dark spots would be tempered chocolate segments, sort of in untempered. So that would be a combination of other forms. Tempered chocolate, you want this form 5. Okay, you see that orange oval there. That's your goal, is that all that form 5, that all those cocoa butter molecules are connected to each other using that form 5 crystal. Okay, how do we do that? Well, we have to take chocolate through a very specific heating and cooling curve to get the right structure. So let's talk about the structure here. And let's use Legos as an example. So you can take a standard 2x4 Lego brick, and they're all the same. You can take a whole bunch of these same bricks, and it turns out you can connect them in repeating ways, but in different repeating ways. You can see 3 examples here on the right. Cocoa butter molecules are exactly the same. It's the same molecule, or a similar molecule, right? And it can connect in these repeating patterns. Now, it turns out that tempered chocolate is one form, one crystal structure that we want. And you'll notice here, if I were to actually press against these stacks that I've made, some will fall apart easier than others. And that's exactly true in the world of cocoa butter. That's why the melting temperature of some of these forms is lower than the other, because it takes less energy, or heat in this case, to actually break apart the structures. It turns out that the one we want is the one of the highest melting temperatures. So what we're going to do is, if you look at the pictures on the left, if chocolate is completely melted, you have all these individual molecules or bricks. But if we take it down just to the temperature that we want, we're going to get some of these structures. In our case, the form 5 crystal structure. Those will start generating, and then that's what we call tempered chocolate. And to do that, we take the chocolate through a very specific heating and cooling curve. And here I'll walk you through what that looks like. So if you start off with solid chocolate, let's start on the left of the graph. It may be tempered, it may be completely untempered, it may be that you made it fresh, and so it's never crystallized at all. But you're gonna heat it up if it's solid, and you're gonna essentially melt away all the crystals that exist. Okay. Typically, people say 120 degrees. But really above, about 100 or higher, most of those crystals are not going to be there anymore. You're then going to cool that chocolate. And it's not until you hit that form 5 zone where those crystals will start to form. In other words, it's cold enough that that structure can be generated, that you'll start what we call seeding, right? Creating these form 5 beta crystals. Okay, so it's a combination of being the right temperature and wiping shear forces that come together to generate these crystals. And typically you want about 1 or 2% of these seed crystals. That's sufficient to then temper the whole batch of chocolate. Now it's okay, you see in the graph here, if you dip into the form 4 zone, that's not a terrible thing, because we can always, at the final final end of the process, warm it back up. And as I mentioned, these other lower forms will melt away because they're not as stable. Okay, so then what you're going to be left with at the end is chocolate with some form 5 beta crystals. And at that point, if you let it solidify or crystallize, you're going to get tempered chocolate. And that chocolate will be shiny. It'll snap nicely when you break it. It'll melt nicely in your mouth. It won't melt in your hands. And that's what we call tempered chocolate. The next step, obviously, is once you temper the chocolate, you're going to pour it in your mold. And an important fact about chocolate here is that chocolate is what you call a non-Newtonian fluid. That means that the viscosity of the chocolate, how thick it is, actually changes if you were to vibrate the chocolate. So a lot of times you go to a chocolate factory, or even in your own home, if you're making chocolate, you're going to take chocolate you've poured in a mold, and you're going to bang it on the table or put it on a little vibration table, or they have these vibrators that will vibrate the chocolate to get it to spread out in the mold in a factory line. And that's because they do that because the viscosity of the chocolate, meaning it will get thinner. If you look at this graph, it will become thinner, meaning it'll spread easier. The bubbles that may be in that chocolate will float out easier if you vibrate the chocolate, as opposed to if you just left it still and tried to let it flow on its own. So chocolate is a non-Newtonian fluid. Okay, so some other interesting facts or maybe questions that people have that I wanted to answer so that you can become a true chocolate geek. Let's start with some terminology questions. So cacao versus cocoa. What is the right terminology? Well, I've probably switched back and forth. I've changed over time. I'll explain what I've heard, and you can sort of decide where you want to live in this world. One is that the plant and the sort of the organic natural product is cacao. But once you transform it into something else, meaning ferment it, roast it, process it, then it becomes a cocoa product. So cocoa beans and cocoa nibs, cocoa butter, cocoa powder. I've heard other explanations that, you know, cacao is Spanish and cocoa is English. And so depending on what language you're speaking, you use one or the other. I don't think there's really a standard in the chocolate industry. So whatever you're comfortable using, I guess maybe be consistent. I don't know if I am, but if you want to try to be, that's some of the ways you can sort of draw those lines. Infusions or flavorings versus inclusions. So an infusion means some, let's say, ingredient that you add into the chocolate itself that will flavor the chocolate. And that can be spice, vanilla, could be cardamom or cinnamon. It could be an oil, like a mint oil, versus an inclusion, which is going to be a solid piece that's embedded in the chocolate. You'll see on the left here, we have almonds, toasted almonds and raisins, or in the middle, it's a white chocolate with broken up pieces of candy cane. Those are inclusions. And on the right, you see a chocolate flavored with coffee. Okay, so infusions versus inclusions. I think it's interesting to look at, you know, what goes into chocolate quality. Now, there's some properties that you can affect if you're making chocolate, or the chocolate makers can affect, and there's some that are out of their control. So for example, obviously one major determinant is the quality of the cacao, the varietal. We touched on this before. Fine flavored cacao versus less flavored or maybe off flavored cacao. How it's fermented, whether it's fully fermented or partially fermented or over fermented, can have an effect, a significant effect on the flavor of the chocolate. How the product is stored or shipped around, if it's properly dried. If not, you may get mildew and mold, which can create funky flavors. And then what's in the chocolate maker's control, obviously roast. The roast profile, whether it's lightly roasted, dark roasted, over roasted, can affect flavor. And how it's refined, you can end up with a gritty chocolate or really smooth chocolate. Some will want intentionally gritty chocolate. A stone ground chocolate can be textured, and that's fine if that's the goal. Again, conching, some debate whether it's required or not, but obviously it has an effect on the flavor. And tempering, whether it's properly tempered, will certainly, you know, if you leave a chocolate bar in your car, if you've ever done that, and then or left it in your cabinet for a long time, you go back to it and you eat it, it can taste crumbly, it won't melt at the same temperature, it's a different experience. And then finally, it is a fat. Fats can go rancid. Doesn't happen very quickly with cocoa butter, but certainly over time, your chocolate can transform from form 5 actually to what's called form 6. So if you've ever pulled a bar out that's been sitting in your cabinet for a long time and it's a little bit harder, again, doesn't melt quite right, it's probably now a form 6, has form 6 crystals in it, or structure to it. Okay, let's get into more chocolate politics. White chocolate, is it really chocolate or not? So what is in white chocolate? Well, there's sugar, there's cocoa butter, and milk powder. Those are the 3 ingredients that are in white chocolate. So, well, where does the cocoa butter come from? Well, half nibs are fat. That fat's cocoa butter. Thus, the sort of debate. Well, it doesn't have any of the solids. It doesn't have any of the brown parts in it, but it's 50% of what a cocoa nib is, or 50% of what comes from the cocoa nib. So that's, again, debate. I'm not going to choose sides here. I think the question is, do you like it or not? Is it tasty or not? And you know, eat it. Eat it or not is your choice. Those are the facts, and you can sort of make your own determination. Cacao, or we've seen cocoa percentage. Let's talk about that a little bit and how that's calculated. Well, it turns out it's not based on how many nibs, how much nibs are in your bar. It's actually the sum of two things. It's the sum of nibs plus any cocoa butter. So again, white chocolate will have a cacao or cocoa percentage. But let's talk about that a little bit, because you know, what you see on a label isn't necessarily what you get. So if you look all the way on the left here, you can have a bar that's 100% cacao, and it can just be made by all nibs. Okay. Now you can get another bar that also says 100% on it, but guess what? It's actually a combination of nibs and cocoa butter. It may not be as intensely flavored. That may make it more palatable. But certainly if you're looking for the healthiest chocolate, you have to look at the label. Now you can, again, we talk about nibs being 50% fat. So if you look on the label, first, it should be listed in the ingredients if they've added cocoa butter. But if you want to figure out how much, you know that the nibs are about 50% fat. So if you look on the label and you see if it's a 100-gram bar and there are 50 grams of fat there, you know it's pretty much, you know, 100% nibs. If there's 75 grams of fat, then you know that about how much you can calculate for white milk dark, how much fat has been added. And again, you know, 75%, just moving along, would be 75% nibs and or any added cocoa butter. And then that means it's 25% sugar. Okay. Milk, again, because it has the cocoa nibs and cocoa butter, you can have a percentage that's, I think, a newer trend to put percentages on milk and white chocolate, but you will find it out there now. All right. Chocolate is a drug. It has an active ingredient. It's theobromine. And it's a stimulant. Now, it's not as stimulating as caffeine, and they are related. Theobromine and caffeine are related. In fact, when you ingest caffeine, your body will metabolize caffeine into 3 compounds as part of its process, and one of those is theobromine. And there's a little bit of caffeine in chocolate as well. Typically, it's about 2% theobromine. We can metabolize it, meaning digest it, but animals like dogs, a dog cannot, and that's in fact what will kill a dog. It's the theobromine. So obviously, white chocolate not as bad because there's not a lot of theobromine in it. Any dark chocolate is very bad, very bad for dogs. Another fact: U.S. is not the biggest consumer of chocolate, even though we like to be #1 in a lot of things. We're lower on the list. Switzerland traditionally holds that spot, eating about 10 pounds of chocolate per person per year. We're at about half of that. I guess good for us. I don't know. Maybe my guess is they're probably eating finer chocolate than we are. But we are not #1 in the world of chocolate consumers. And then just some fun with chocolate. We'll touch on a couple things. So rainbow chocolate, the one on the left there, that is actually an optical effect on the surface of a chocolate. That rainbow is not imprinted. The rainbow colors are not imprinted on that chocolate. And as you change the angle of that chocolate, you're going to get different rainbow effects. So if you've ever seen those glasses that you look up into the light and it creates rainbows, those are typically diffraction gratings. It's little slits that are cut into a piece of plastic. Turns out that if you take your chocolate and temper it and put it on one of those diffraction gratings, you will actually imprint those tiny little lines into the surface of the chocolate, and it will then diffract the light. So literally those lines are about the wavelength of light. It's amazing that you can imprint those small fine features into chocolate, but the cocoa butter molecule obviously is very small, so it can imprint those little lines. And you can create some really amazing effects. In fact, I haven't done it yet, but I do want to try it. You can create a hologram. You can imprint a 3D hologram into the surface of chocolate. And let's talk about Ruby. You've probably heard about it. I don't know if you've tasted it. So what is Ruby chocolate? It's a newer, the newest kind of chocolate is how it's marketed, newest form of chocolate. So what is it? Well, it's a lot like a white chocolate in terms of ingredients, except it has a little bit of cocoa nib, a bean that's actually put back into it. Now, what's interesting about this nib is that it's unfermented. So we talked about the fermentation process. It actually turns the bean, if you just harvest that pod and you look at it, most of them are deep purple. The fermentation process changes that. They turn brown. Roasting makes it even darker brown. So most of your chocolates look like the chocolate on the left. But if you don't ferment that bean, that cocoa bean, and you then acidify it, so in this case, citric acid will be added to this. And what it does, it shifts the color. I don't know if you remember as a kid, you did an experiment. You took purple cabbage and you soaked it in warm water, and then you took the cabbage out and you sort of had this purple water, and you add lemon juice to it and it turns it sort of pink, red. Same thing is happening here. So the color changes based on the acidity of the liquid. So what you can do is take these purple beans, acidify them, and it'll shift it into the red zone, and you mix a little bit of that into a white chocolate and you get pink. And then it tastes, obviously the flavor, you get a little bit of flavor from the bean, but really it's the citric acid, so that's like lemon juice. You get a tang to this product. So it's sort of a fruity, tangy chocolate. There's a little bit of the science there for you. And by the way, this is one, you'll notice these are rings, as Sandra mentioned. These were made on our CocoTerra system, and I'll talk about sort of why we do rings and how that works. But if you're making chocolate at home, again, it can be messy and complicated, and it can take 1, 2, 3 days, but it can be done, and you can buy these different appliances. Here's a champion juicer to do your grinding, an Indian spice grinder, a melanger, wet grinder to do your refining and conching. You can get a tempering machine to learn to table temper. You can get a piping bag to dispense. And finally, you can buy some molds and pour it in there. We've done something a little bit different. We've tried to really simplify the process so that even if you don't have a lot of chocolate knowledge, and now hopefully you do, but there's a sort of difference between holding that knowledge and turning it into something practical. I found it very complicated to go through these steps, very time consuming and difficult, pretty steep learning curve. And so what we did with CocoTerra is really take all the grinding, refining, conching, tempering, dispensing, molding, and unify them into a single appliance. And then you can make your own chocolate, customize the recipe, follow a recipe in 2 hours. So that's really how did I get to all this knowledge? What sort of inspired me was this question of, well, you have ice cream makers and bread makers and pasta makers, coffee makers, tea brewers, like why doesn't a tabletop chocolate maker exist? And through the process of developing this system, I've learned a lot about the chemistry and physics and origins of chocolate. And again, we do create this ring. So it is I'll call it a bar, but it's a never-ending bar of chocolate. And we do that because we're trying to move the chocolate out of our processing chamber. And by spinning the chamber, we can actually move it really well. Again, we talked about this being a non-Newtonian fluid, so a little vibration plus centrifugal force allows us to move the chocolate. And so we catch it in this ring. Obviously, you can remelt it or pour it out to use any molds you want. You can also put inclusions into that ring. You can put decorations, transfer sheets into that ring. It makes white milk dark. Really, the goal is to let people play, let people experiment, and make chocolate making more accessible. So if you want to learn more or stay connected, certainly go to our website, sign up for a newsletter. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Feel free to connect to us and follow us. And at this point, I will open it up to questions. If people have questions, please open up your app. You can type the questions into the app, and I'm happy to answer them. Any questions? All right, I have one here. I don't know if my moderator is around, but curious if you can share some information about Ruby chocolate. We did that a little bit, and what the chocolate making community thinks about it. So, you know, my sense is that it falls very much into the category of white chocolate. I think there's some people who are not fans of white chocolate. I think for the same reason they're not fans of Ruby chocolate. I think, you know, it's the flavor, again, it's not a traditional chocolate flavor. It's, you know, so again, this sort of fruity, tangy creation. So I think for traditional chocolate lovers and eaters, it's a different animal, but you know, it has value in and of itself. I think Kit Kat was the first to use it in a Kit Kat bar, and I think, you know, for the right purpose with the right flavor profiles for certain desserts, if you're using, you know, passion fruit, something, I think it probably is a very fine complement. There is a question about a video of the machine. I'll see if I can pull that up. If not, if you go to CocoTerra.com and you click on the right at the top of the page, there's a video there. There are actually two forms. There's a short, like a minute-long video and a 2-minute-long video that you can watch the whole chocolate making process. I can go into that certainly if people are interested. Let's see, I have a question here. It says, I've always heard that you need at least 12 hours in a melanger to get chocolate smooth enough that doesn't taste gritty. How does your machine do it in 2 hours? So that is correct. So a stone grinder or a melanger is less efficient than what we do. And so what we're doing is using a ball mill. So a ball mill is stainless steel media, and it's actually used commonly with chocolate manufacturing. It's stainless steel media which is moved around, and you can get the idea. It's much more efficient. So if you think about a stone grinder, you have a cylinder that's rotating on a flat plane, and the only area where it's actually grinding and refining is in a single line, right? The intersection of a cylinder and a plane. If you use a ball mill and you start moving these balls around in sort of chaotic motion, you have many more interactions, much more of the material gets processed in the same amount of time. And so it's a much more efficient grinding, refining process. And so literally we can get down to, 20 microns in fact, 2 hours is, from pouring in the ingredients all the way to sort of solid chocolate. So in fact, you can get to 20 microns in about an hour and a half on our system if you want to, if you don't care about tempering and molding and all that. So let's see what else we have here. What countries of origin are easier to work with from bean to bar? So so I played with a lot, mostly on our machine, and there are differences, and particularly there are some origins that are quite viscous, and that can cause trouble with the equipment and the machines. So Ecuador, like Camino Verde, can be much more viscous. Now, why that is, some people, I don't know, some people it may be the amount of water that's left in it. Some so there's something about the organic matter in those beans. But you end up with a really thick chocolate, which then makes the tempering process harder, which then the molding process, which then can clog up your machine, etc. So yes, there are some origins, and now there are others that I've played with that have a higher fat content as well. And so that obviously makes it just much easier because it's just much more fluid and liquid. And again, you're going to have fewer challenges or problems with your machine. Let's see, we have someone asking about Ruby chocolate again. I was at the initial product launch of Ruby, Shanghai in 2017. The first recipe is a milk chocolate equivalent. I've tasted a dark chocolate equivalent. I haven't, I've only seen sort of the milk chocolate equivalent, which is the one I showed. I haven't seen a dark chocolate, but certainly, yeah, you can do the same thing. You can combine these unfermented acidified beans with certainly with roasted beans, and you'll get some, I guess, fruity, tangy combination of the two. My guess is it's going to taste something like a chocolate from Madagascar, which has a lot more acetic acid in it, which makes it more fruity. All right, so we have another question here. It says, how much is the cost of the tabletop chocolate maker? Any discounts for attendees? Good question. So we haven't yet released the price point and the date yet. So, but our goal is to make this a mass market appliance. Our goal is to make this affordable. You know, the earlier, when we do smaller volume batches, they're going to be higher price point, but the goal really is to get the product down and make it something that everybody can have in their kitchen. We want people to play, we want people to have fun, and we want people to be able to afford this. I should mention, we will also be providing ingredients. So that's one of the big questions we always get. You know, is where am I going to get the nibs or the beans to do this? Now, the starting ingredient for our machine is actually roasted nibs. So think about the coffee world. Most people don't buy green coffee beans. They're buying roasted coffee beans. So we're modeling that same experience. We will be providing roasted nibs. We'll work with chocolate makers, other farms, and other importers to make those nibs available. Our goal is to make a variety of nibs. It's not a closed system, it's an open system. If you go traveling and you buy beans and you want to roast them yourself, that's fine. You have to develop a recipe, make sure that it works on the system. But the goal really is to open up this whole world of chocolate flavor and flavor profiles and you know, nuance, really the fine flavor of chocolate. Let people customize, whether it's for health reasons, if you have allergies or you're allergic to milk, you know, dairy, you're lactose intolerant, you want vegan chocolate, you want to use unrefined sugars, you want to use alternative sugars. The goal is really to allow all of those recipes to exist.
It just had my birthday.
Again, we have also which countries of origin are easiest to work with using your tabletop chocolate maker. Again, there's some that are going to be more viscous. All equipment needs a certain amount of fat to be able to run. And so as long as you hit that sort of minimal fat content, then the equipment will run properly. And that's really one of the reasons, or one of the differences between sort of home or craft chocolate making and what you get in industrial systems, right? They need to pump this chocolate through tubes and through systems, which means it has to have a certain viscosity, and that starts limiting the recipes that they can use. And again, we don't move chocolate around other than into the mold. So there's a lot more flexibility in terms of the recipe and the fat content that works in our system. Literally everything happens in this one chamber. So all your grinding, refining, conching, tempering until you're ready to mold. And so we don't have the same constraints of moving fat around through tubes. Let's see. Where can we go to stay informed about the chocolate machine, the CocoTerra machine? Is there a page where we can add our email address? Yeah, so if you go to CocoTerra.com, that's CocoTerra. You see here, I'll actually go back one slide so you can see that information. Yeah, if you want to be the first to know about when this machine gets launched, subscribe to our newsletter. If you want to see what we're doing sort of behind the scenes, we make chocolate all the time. We have different farms and different chocolate makers sending us ingredients and flavorings and whatnot. We experiment with all of these, making sure they work with the system. I'm also assessing quality, and we will be partnering with a number of these different folks. So I would say if you're a consumer, yeah, follow us and sign up. If you're a chocolate maker and you're interested in selling ingredients through our platform, then definitely send us an email. If you go to our website, there's a contact page, and you can find us there. Otherwise, if you're just sort of fascinated by what comes out of the machine, you can just follow us on Instagram, and we post pictures all the time. We had another question here about the size of the batch that we make. So we make a ½ pound of chocolate at a time. The goal was really to make sort of a week's worth of, what you might eat, or a dinner party's worth of chocolate. So the nice thing is, imagine you have people over for dinner, you start a batch of chocolate when you're cooking dinner, and for dessert, you have this fresh batch of chocolate, you bring out this ring of chocolate, you get to smash it up. There's actually something very fun about that. And the other thing I'll mention is that a typical experience that most people don't get is freshly molded chocolate. Most of what you're going to buy in the stores, is at least a month old or whatever it is. But if you eat chocolate within the first 24 hours, you actually get a very different experience. It hasn't fully crystallized. And so when you eat this chocolate, I'll call it fresh chocolate, it melts in your mouth. The mouth feel is amazing. It's incredible. And so that's the other, I think, piece of this that you don't typically get from traditional chocolate outlets, is that you will have this sort of this melt in your mouth, just heavenly experience. And the other fun part is really sort of recreating chocolate memories. A lot of people say, you get to, you have these chocolate memories as a kid. We want you to be able to sort of relive those memories, recreate them, and then share them with other people and share community. Let's see, it's going through here, seeing if there are any questions. Yeah, and there was, I guess, a question about discount for attendees. Because we're not selling them right yet, we're not providing discounts, but certainly if you sign up for our newsletters for early buyers, I'm sure there will be a discount. So that's the way to do it. Let's see what other questions we have. And I don't know if my moderators are around yet. No? All right.
Yes,
so I'm gonna...
we're here, but it looks like you've gotten most of the questions already.
Yeah, if there are any other interesting questions that you saw on there, please let me know. But I think I've got most of them. So yeah, and if there are any others, you can continue to post to the session questions, and if there are any that don't get answered, that haven't gotten answered here, certainly we'll answer them in the app. But I want to thank everyone who joined. I hope you found this fascinating, interesting, a little bit nerdy, educational, and be in touch, keep in touch, and thank you for joining us today.